This is video number 2 of our lessons, and I'm going to show you today how to add some texture to your watercolor. First, I'm going to put a nice glaze of green using a big brush, lots of water on my paper, and add some other colors in here to make variations of green. And while it's still wet, I'm going to take a piece of, this is just plastic wrap from my kitchen, and I'm going to set it right down on there and crinkle it up. You can move the paint around and not get your hands dirty because you're working through the plastic. And I think that's about done the way I want it. And then I'm going to show you another texture. We let that dry completely before we lift up the plastic wrap. This time I'm going to put some red on my paper, and I'm going to shade that on one side a little bit. Maybe it's grapes. It kind of looks like grapes now, doesn't it? But we're going to add some texture to the grapes, and we're going to sprinkle it with kosher salt. What happens is the salt will bring up the pigment and dry it out, and then when we brush it off, well, you'll see that we have a texture of little white dots on there. Another thing we can do to get texture is to use what we call a dry brush. And I have sprayed my watercolor palette here so that my colors are a little bit damp. And I'm squeezed the water out of my brush, and I'm going to do a dry brush on my paper. Using this dry brush, I'm going to put the paint on my paper, and what happens is it touches just the top part of the paper. Your paper has what we call a tooth. It's not completely smooth. It has a texture to it, and when you use a dry brush, the paint will stick to the raised parts of your paper. So now we have 3 different textures. This could be raindrops on grapes, this could be a cornfield, and that could be the side of a barn. There, we have some different textures, and we are going to now start working on a painting using these textures. Do I hit? We are now going to create a painting where I'm using those techniques that I just showed you to show texture in your painting. And I am going to make this hill at the bottom of my paper. But before I start that, I need to get my paper wet. I want the water to flow a little bit at the bottom of my paper. So using a clean brush, I am just adding water onto the plain white paper, and then I'm going to start adding my green here at the bottom. See how nicely it blends and runs? And I have a couple of different greens on my palettes here. You can see one's a bright green, one's a little bit duller, and this is going to be a hillside when I'm all finished. And I'm going to add maybe a little blue in here. Maybe this is a waterfall that comes over the side of the hill. I'm not sure. I really don't care. You can use your own interpretation here. And while it's still wet, I'm going to add some wildflowers. And to do that, I'm just going to put my brush into some red and add the wild. Oh, wasn't that fun? I splattered those wildflowers all over the side of the hill. And now I'm going to work on the top. The top of my painting, the upper part here, is going to be woods. And again, I want to have my paper a little more wet than it is. And I'm adding a light brown up here at the top. And you're going to see how I develop some trees. Doesn't look like trees now, but it will. And I don't mind that some of that green rushes up into the tree area because there could be tall grass there at the top. And I'm going to darken along the edge. You know, when you see the edge of a field and you're looking into woods, down at the bottom, at the tree line, it's darker usually. That could be rocks or something like that. Now at the bottom, it's still wet. I'm going to add a little more green in here and some spots just to make some more contour to the field. And I'm going to put my piece of plastic wrap over it. You'll see later that this looks a little bit like rocks on the side of the hill. Or grasses. Need a little more over here. There. Now while I'm letting that dry, I'm going to work up here at the top. And I'm going to decide where my trees are. Now that's not a tree, believe it or not. That's the space in between the tree. There's the trunk of the tree. See how I left that lighter spot and filled in behind? I just have to kind of decide, how would this forest grow? Now that one got a little fat. So to make it a little skinnier, I use what we call a thirsty brush. I've gotten the brush wet and then I squeeze the water out of it and drag it up through there. That's probably a sycamore tree because it's so light. And I keep developing trees here. That one's kind of in front of the others, so I'm going to bring that trunk down a little bit. See what fun this is, to just kind of make these things develop? Here's my sycamore. That one's lighter. And here's another sycamore. Sycamores like to grow along the creek, so we'll put this one next to the creek. We'll leave this a little bit open here for the water to flow, and we'll fill in around it. I'm not worried about the tops of the trees. They're up in the off the edge of the paper. But that's okay. Our imagination can fill them in. And got some blue there. We can add some green at the tops for the growth at the tops of the trees. And a little bit of yellow here for some sunlight. And we've got our trees established now. I'm going to set this aside for a little while and talk to you about the salt application. We're not going to use that today on this painting, but we're going to use it in lessons in the future. I'll set this aside and I'll show you what happens with salt. There's our salt application, and it's about dry enough so that we can brush it off. Notice I have quite a bit of pigment there. And see how it left lighter spots on the red? This is what happens when you use too much water. This has a lot of pigment in it, meaning I used a thicker paint, less water. This one I used too much water, and it just did not show any much contrast between where the salt was and where it wasn't. So this is just to show you an example of too much water. All right, I've hit this painting with a little bit of the hair dryer to get it dry enough so that I could pull off the plastic wrap and see what we've got here. That's formed by the plastic wrap that I had on my paper. Looks like the roots of the trees. Here we've got the water and maybe some waterfall. That happens to do that itself. I did not plan that. That's what we call a happy accident. And it's a bloom where wet paint hit damp paint, and right there we've got a bloom. We've got another one up here at the top where I put on the green, but that actually looks like the foliage of the tree, so I'm going to leave that. I ended up with a few lighter spots here where I didn't fill in around the trees. And I'm going to just put some blue in those spots, like blue sky. And it's this where, you know, the sky does show up between the trees. I studied with one artist one time who always said, make your tree look like the birds can fly through it. So there are some opening spots for the birds to fly through on my painting. And now I want to add some bark. Here I've started to add the bark on the tree, and that's by using my dry brush. Remember I told you about dry brush technique at the very beginning of this video, and I'm going to add some dry brush here. There's some bark on the tree. So it just picks up the bumps in the on the paper. Here's another spot for the birds to fly through. And these are sycamores because they're by the creek. So with this sycamore, I'm going to add, sycamore has darker patches on it. And using a very small brush, this is called a rigger brush. See how the point, it comes to such a beautiful point. And to make those little spots on the sycamore tree, I'm going to just add some darker spots here. And I'm kind of using the side of my brush. Just to give those trees a little extra texture. And I'm also going to shade one side. Since this has more sky showing, that's probably where the sun is coming through the trees. So I'm going to make the shadow on these trees on the opposite side so we can develop a sun angle. That's a good thing to remember when you're working on a landscape. Figure out the direction of the sun and kind of use that to help develop your landscape. And well, maybe we have a branch that goes through across the sky there, and maybe another one here, just to give it some overlap. There, I think this is about finished, and we've got shadows. Maybe I could add a little shadow here. If the sun's coming from this direction, maybe it shines through the trees and causes a little bit of shadow here in the front. I'm mixing some of my paints on the there's some shadows. They're a little too stiff, so we just add a little bit of water to them and make them move. There, and we're finished with that landscape. So now you've seen how to develop a painting. You can see the bottom where the flowers are and the top where the trees are. That's all for this lesson today. Go out and try.